This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can pre-order every card in this set review by going to cardkingdom.com/needsahone or by following the link in the description. Hi everyone, I'm Needsahone, and today I'm continuing with my Brothers War Limited set review. So far we've looked at every single card in the main set, but we still have the Retroframe artifacts. Every single pack of the Brothers War contains one of these Retroframe artifacts, much in the same way Strixhaven packs contained a single card from the Mystical Archive. These cards are all reprints, and most of them are fairly iconic or at least well-known artifacts from Magic's past. Because these show up so much, I thought it made sense to do an entire video on them, so that's what we're doing today. In these set review videos, I discuss how good I think these new cards will be in the new limited format. I use a letter grade system to sum up my thoughts on each of these cards, and if you aren't sure what those letter grades mean, check out the description where you'll find an explanation. Keep in mind that these are my feelings about these cards before actually playing the new format, and that means I'm definitely not going to be perfect in my predictions, even in the cases where these are all reprints, and I've played with a lot of them in limited formats before. It's hard to perfectly figure out how good they're going to be in a new limited format. But the good news is I'll be updating the channel with my thoughts on the format as they change. All right, with all of that out of the way, let's dive into the review. Our first card is Adaptive Automaton, which for 3 generic is a 2/2 artifact creature construct at rare. When it enters the battlefield, you choose a creature type. It's the chosen type in addition to its other types, and other creatures you control of the chosen type get +1/+1. So there's really only one really prominent tribe in this format, and that's Soldiers, which is the blue-white deck, and this will definitely fit in nicely there, but you might be surprised how easily a card like this can fit into other decks too. The format also has tons of humans and Phyrexians, and don't be surprised if you look at your deck and you have like 5 or 6 creatures with the same type, and if you do, this is certainly playable. It gets better the higher that number can get, of course, but I think you value this fairly highly. I'm giving it a B-. Next, it's Aetherflux Reservoir, which for 4 generic mana is a mythic rare artifact. Whenever you cast a spell, you gain 1 life for each spell you cast this turn. Pay 50 life, Aetherflux Reservoir deals 50 to any target. So a lot of these Retroframe artifacts are very niche, and they're not really here for limited at all. They're here because people like to play with them in EDH, or because they want to put them into constructed formats, especially on Magic Arena, and this is one of those, and there's a lot more of them. There's going to be a lot of Ds and Fs in this video, more than you would normally see in one of these videos, and this is obviously one of those Fs. Storm isn't a deck that works in limited, outside of Cube. You won't ever gain enough life for this to matter, and you're never, ever, ever using this ability. It's an F. Next up, it's Altar of Dementia, which for 2 generic is a mythic rare artifact. It says sacrifice a creature. Target player mills cards equal to the sacrificed creature's power. This format has enough big monsters in it that I think Altar of Dementia has a bit of potential. Plus, you can use it to mill yourself, and the black-green deck in the format is interested in that. There's also a pretty legitimate sacrifice deck in the format, and so you have some fodder you can sacrifice. I do think this is an F in almost every deck in the format, and it may just end up being an F in all the decks in the format, but I can maybe see a deck where there's enough upside in running this, either because you can legitimately mill out your opponent with it by sacrificing something big, or because you can load your own graveyard. So, I think maybe the ceiling on this card is a C+, but it's definitely going to be more like an F most of the time. Next up, it's Ashnod's Altar, which for 3 generic is a rare artifact. Sacrifice a creature, add 2 colorless. This is another card that's not too bad as a sacrifice outlet, and there is a market for those in the format. It can also ramp you into some big scary things, though with all the power stones, you're not as desperate for that in this format as you might normally be. It is tempting to look at this and think of the crazy upside where you slam a huge creature by giving up a bunch of your creatures, like you played a 2-drop, 3-drop, 4-drop, then on turn 5 you spend 10 and play the big 10/10 Reach Trampler. That sounds pretty cool, but if your opponent has removal, you just lost the game, and it's not impossible for your opponent to find their way out of that situation. So giving up a bunch of cards to produce this mana just isn't worth it most of the time. Now, you can sacrifice things like tokens or things that are already good sacrifice fodder, and there are a lot of mana sinks in the format that you can use this mana on, not to mention big things you can ramp into, even at lower rarities. This is another one where it's an F most of the time, but I do think this one will be more useful more frequently than Altar of Dementia, though maybe it doesn't have quite as high of a ceiling. I think it'll be a C in a deck that can actually take advantage of this as a sacrifice outlet. Next, it's Astral Cornucopia, which for XXX is a rare artifact. It enters the battlefield with X charge counters on it. You tap it and choose a color, and it adds 1 mana of that color for each charge counter on it. This is mostly a 3-mana mana rock that can tap for 1, and that's passable in a format with a bunch of artifact and ramp payoffs. You can use a bunch of Power Stones to make it better than that, of course, which is some decent format-specific upside, but this still isn't that impressive, giving it a C-. Next up, it's Black Blade Reforged, which for 2 generic mana is a legendary artifact equipment at rare. Equipped creature gets +1/+1 for each land you control. Equip legendary creature for 3, or equip to anything else for 7. Last time we saw this was on Dominaria, a set with lots of legendary creatures, so you actually ended up only paying 3 to equip it pretty often. There aren't enough legendary creatures in this format for you to consistently equip this for the lower cost, though. But with Power Stones around, actually paying to equip this is going to be more approachable than it was last time we saw it. Obviously, the boost is massive, but equipping it is still clunky enough that I don't love it. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Bone Saw, which for 0 mana is an uncommon artifact equipment. Equipped creature gets +1/+0, equip 1. So 0 mana artifacts are things that get people excited, and they should. They're powerful in that they let you do something for nothing, right? But in Limited, a 0 mana artifact that has basically no impact on the game, which is basically what this is, it just doesn't do enough to be worth it in your deck, you're effectively paying too much for the card by simply putting it in your deck and having it be a card in your deck. Maybe you don't pay mana for it, but the card that you use is a resource, and it's almost like you mulligan when you play something like this. And yes, I know, +1/+0 doesn't have 0 effect on the game, but it has pretty close to 0 effect on the game. You'd much rather play a creature out than this. You know, you'd much rather play like a 3-mana 3/3 than a Bone Saw. If this format had like an equipment deck, I could maybe see it making it in, but it doesn't. Even with all the artifact payoffs and stuff, you're not going to be so hungry for artifacts that you play Bone Saw. It's just an F in Limited. Next up, it's Burnished Heart, which for 3 generic mana is a 2/2 artifact creature elk at uncommon. You pay 3 and sack it. Search your library for up to 2 basic lands, put them onto the battlefield tapped, and then shuffle. This is a great source for ramp and fixing, and its baseline is a Grey Ogre with a useful card type. I'm giving this a B. Next up, it's Caged Sun, which for 6 generic mana is a mythic rare artifact. As it enters the battlefield, choose a color. Creatures you control of the chosen color get +1/+1. Whenever a land's ability causes you to add 1 or more mana of the chosen color, add 1 additional mana of that color. This is powerful, of course, but it's pretty awkward for Limited. First of all, you're usually a 2-color deck, so all your creatures aren't going to get buffed by this, and not all of your lands will be augmented. Additionally, there's lots of artifact creatures and artifact creature tokens that are colorless in the set, which also don't get any help from Caged Sun. One bit of good news is, if you cast a creature for its prototype cost, it does have a color, but still, this seems a little too specific about what it benefits in a format where you'll almost always be fairly evenly divided between 2 colors. The one thing this format does have going for it is you can ramp into it with Power Stones, and then maybe it helps you ramp even more. But this is probably not more than a C+. If you manage to be a monocolor deck, obviously it's way better, but that's going to be hard to do. Next up, it's Chromatic Lantern, which for 3 generic is a rare artifact. Lands you control have tap, add 1 mana of any color, and you can tap it to add 1 mana of any color. This gives you good fixing and a little bit of ramp, things that are reasonably beneficial, but you do have to remember it doesn't add to the board in any meaningful way, and that's always a problem, giving it a C. Next, it's Chromatic Star, which for 1 generic mana is an uncommon artifact. You can pay 1 and tap it and sack it to add 1 mana of any color, and when it's put into a graveyard from the battlefield, draw a card. Because this is a non-creature spell and an artifact that replaces itself, it's going to be very playable, as there are decks in the format that care about those things. It also fixes your mana, of course, though it's obviously kind of clunky. If you're just using it for that, you really want to be playing it in a deck that can get value out of it being a non-creature spell or an artifact, and then the fixing part is just additional upside. You shouldn't be playing it just for fixing. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Cloud Key, which for 3 generic mana is a rare artifact. When it enters the battlefield, you choose artifact, creature, enchantment, instant, or sorcery, and spells you cast of the chosen type cost 1 less to cast. Using up a card to reduce the cost of 1 card type just isn't worth it most of the time in Limited. Again, you really want to add to the board in some way and get an effect like this, and that's not an option here. Even in a world where you ramp a lot, using up a card and mana to play this doesn't feel very good, giving this a D. Next, it's Defense Grid, which for 2 generic mana is a rare artifact. Each spell costs 3 more to cast except during its controller's turn. This is too narrow. It's a sweet sideboard card and constructed, of course, but there aren't decks that are just all about leaving their mana up and interacting with you on their turn in limited. Or on your turn, rather. Against most decks, this will do nothing, and even as a sideboard card, you're almost never bringing it in. It's an F. Next, it's Door to Nothingness, which for 5 generic is a rare artifact. It enters tapped, and you can pay 2 mana of each color and sack it to have target player lose the game. This format does not have very good fixing, so you're almost never going to be able to utilize this to win the game, and if you're not doing that, it's awful. This is an F. Next, it's Elsewhere Flask, which for 2 generic mana is an uncommon artifact. When it enters the battlefield, you draw a card, and you can sack it and choose a basic land type. Each land you control becomes that type until end of turn. This is another artifact that replaces itself, and that's enough in this format for it to be decent, since the blue-red deck likes casting non-creature spells, and lots of decks like artifacts. It can also fix your mana some, but that's a small part of what it does. It's a C-. Next, it's Foundry Inspector, which for 3 generic mana is a 3/2 artifact creature constructed uncommon. Artifact spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. This looks amazing in this format because most decks will very easily have 7 or more artifacts, and some will have even more. This makes your artifacts easy to cast while adding a very real body to the board. That makes it a heck of a lot better than something like Cloud Key. This is a B. Next, it's Gilded Lotus, which for 5 generic mana is a rare artifact, and you can tap it for 3 mana of any one color. This is pretty bad in most limited formats. Usually by the time you get this much mana, you don't really need more mana, but I think the fact that this format has many high mana things to ramp into, coupled with the fact that you can actually accelerate into the Lotus itself with Power Stones, makes this a little better. Probably still just a C, though. Next up, it's Goblin Charbelcher, which for 4 generic mana is a rare artifact. You pay 3 and tap it, and reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal a land card. The Charbelcher deals damage equal to the number of non-land cards revealed this way to any target. If the revealed land card was a mountain, Charbelcher deals double that damage instead. Put the revealed card in the bottom of your library in any order. This powers some decks in Modern and Legacy, but it is awful in Limited. You can't build a landless deck and go wild here. It's an F. Next, it's Helm of the Host, which for 4 generic mana is a mythic rare legendary artifact equipment. At the beginning of combat on your turn, create a token that's a copy of equipped creature, except the token isn't legendary. If equipped creature is legendary, that token gains haste and equip for 5. This was a bomb the last time we saw it. One I famously, or infamously, underrated in my set review by so much that I actually gave it an F. Hey, it was several years ago. Anyway, I thought it just asked too much mana for it to be good, but I was very wrong. Turns out paying 4 one turn and then 5 on another turn while you churn out a creature every turn is insane, and it just snowballs. And it may be even better here than it was last time because Power Stones make it easier to equip and cast. I think this is a straight up A+. You can play it in every single deck. You know, if you're first picking it, it's going to make your deck, and that's always great. Next, it's Howling Mine, which for 2 generic is a rare artifact. At the beginning of each player's draw step, if Howling Mine is untapped, that player draws an additional card. I like drawing extra cards. I don't like letting my opponent draw extra cards too, especially because in this case they draw first. Generally, this benefits your opponent more than it benefits you because of that, and that really hurts this card's value. I think it's a D. Next, it's Icore Wellspring, which for 2 generic is an uncommon artifact. When it enters the battlefield or is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, draw a card. Another 2 mana artifact that replaces itself, and that's nice. And this one's even nicer because you can make it a 2-for-1, especially in the black-red deck, where this is a great thing to sacrifice for value. I think this is a C+. Next up, it's Inspiring Statuary, which for 3 generic is a rare artifact. Non-artifact spells you cast have Improvise, which means your artifacts can help cast those spells. Each artifact you tap after you're done activating mana abilities pays for 1 generic. This is kind of cool, as it sort of makes it so your Power Stones can actually cast non-artifact spells. However, this is another instance where you use up a card for a mana discount, and cards are massively important resources in Limited. Using one to just help you cast your non-artifact spells a little better usually is suboptimal, and it's also really awkward because if you are a Power Stone heavy deck, you want a bunch of artifacts to ramp into, and this can't decrease the costs of those. I think this is a D. Next up, it's Ivory Tower, which for 1 generic mana is an uncommon artifact. At the beginning of your upkeep, you gain X life, where X is the number of cards in your hand minus 4. This isn't good in Limited. You need to be like a draw-go style control deck to really make the life gain matter, and that won't happen. This will frequently do nothing or close to nothing. It's an F. Next, it's Jaloom Tome, which for 3 generic is an uncommon artifact. You can pay 2 and tap it to draw a card and then discard a card. This is a pretty clunky way to loot, but the blue-black deck in the format is interested in this, as it gives you a way to consistently trigger your payoffs for drawing a second card in the turn. That probably makes it a C. Next, it's Journeyer's Kite, which for 2 generic is a rare artifact. You pay 3 and tap it to search your library for a basic land, reveal it, put it into your hand, and then shuffle. This does basically let you draw a card for 3 mana, even if that card is still always a land. That does give you card advantage and even thins out your deck and fixes your mana. Power Stones make it more likely you can use it too, but there's still going to be a whole lot of times where you just don't have the time or mana to use it. And frequently, if you do have the mana to use it, you don't really need more mana. It's probably just a D. Next, it's Keening Stone, which for 6 generic mana is a rare artifact. You can pay 5 and tap it. Target player mills X cards, where X is the number of cards in that player's graveyard. As I always say, mill strategies are usually bad and limited. This one is kind of interesting, especially if you're playing against a black-green self-mill deck, which will rapidly load its own graveyard, allowing you to mill them out with 1 or 2 uses of this. Still, it costs a ton of mana to play and a ton of mana to activate, and sometimes it won't do anything at all. In fact, usually it won't do anything at all. It's probably a sideboard card. It's going to be an F almost all the time. I could see siding it in against a black-green deck where it's probably like a C-. Next up, it's Key to the City, which for 2 generic mana is a rare artifact. You can tap it and discard. Up to 1 target creature can't be blocked this turn, and whenever it becomes untapped, you can pay 2 generic, and if you do, draw a card. This is a nice card. The unblockability is the kind of thing that allows you to close out a game, or just allows you to pressure your opponent no matter what they're doing, and while you have to discard a card for the effect, you are ultimately just rummaging, since you can pay mana to draw a card when it untaps. Power Stones can help pay for that ability too, and you're also interested in a deck like blue-black, you're interested in the additional draw trigger. I'm giving this a B. Next up, it's Liquimetal Coating, which for 2 generic is an uncommon artifact. You can tap it and target permanent becomes an artifact in addition to its other types until end of turn. You don't want to be doing this. For the most part, this effect is meaningless in this format. There are, of course, some corner cases, like if you have a card that destroys artifacts, this lets you make any permanent into an artifact, so you can destroy anything, even lands. Or if you need another artifact in play for some effect, I guess it does that, but there's a reason I said corner cases. You're using up a card here for synergy that will almost never matter. It's an F. Next, it's Lodestone Golem, which for 4 generic mana is a 5/3 artifact creature golem at rare. Non-artifact spells cost 1 more to cast. So this is a 4 mana 5/3, which is close to a C, and it does have an extra effect that adds attacks to non-artifacts. Problem is, the effect is symmetrical and is likely to hurt you and your opponent similar amounts. If you end up with a deck that is very heavy in artifacts and your opponent's deck is surprisingly low on them, it will overperform, but mostly I think this is a C. Next, it's Mazemind Tome, which for 2 generic is a rare artifact. You can tap it and put a page counter on it to scry 1. You can pay 2 and tap it and put a page counter on it to draw a card. And when there are 4 or more page counters on it, you exile it, and if you do, you gain 4. This is pretty good last time we saw it, and I think that's true here. Using the scry effect when you're low on mana is alright, and actually drawing cards with this is very powerful, and also easier to do here because of Power Stones. Gaining the 4 life helps make up for the fact that you sink some mana into something that doesn't actually add to the board too. Giving this a B. Next, it's Mesmeric Orb, which for 2 generic is a mythic rare artifact. Whenever a permanent becomes untapped, that permanent's controller mills a card. This is a symmetrical mill card and not really something you should be playing. It's hard to have much control over who has more permanents to untap, and you never know if this will hurt you more than your opponent. It is true that it will hurt your opponent first, since they have to untap first, but that still isn't enough for me to ever play this thing. I'm giving it an F. Next, it's Millstone, which for 2 generic is an uncommon artifact. You pay 2 and tap it to make your opponent mill 2 cards. Any player mill 2 cards, actually. Now we're looking at the very original mill card, which is where the mechanic gets its name, and it's also not that good and limited, though the fact that you actually can control who this hurts more makes it better than something like the Orb. This can actually win you some games if you're a control deck, but most of the time you'd rather just have something that actually adds to the board. You can maybe use it in the black-green deck to mill yourself too. I'm giving it a D. Next up, it's Mind's Eye, which for 5 generic mana is a mythic rare artifact. Whenever an opponent draws a card, you can pay 1 generic. If you do, draw a card. This looks good, as it effectively draws you 2 cards every turn, and sometimes more. With Power Stones in the format, both casting this and paying the mana to draw the card are going to be easier than normal. It is still a 5-mana artifact that doesn't add to the board, which holds it back significantly, but it's quite the card advantage engine, giving it a B. Next, it's Mishra's Bauble, which for 0 mana is an uncommon artifact, and you can tap it and sack it to look at the top card of target player's library, draw a card at the beginning of the next turn's upkeep. This is a free artifact that replaces itself, and we've seen a few artifacts that replace themselves. They all get bonus points because there's a spell deck in the format, and there's lots of decks that care about artifacts. This one is slower at replacing itself, which is certainly a problem if you're like trying to chain spells together or something. And the other effect it has is pretty minimal, as just knowing what's on top of your opponent's library doesn't matter a ton, so I think it's probably a C-. Next, it's Mox Amber, which is 0 mana for a mythic rare legendary artifact. You can tap it and add 1 mana of any color among legendary creatures and planeswalkers you control. Not enough legendary creatures in this format for you to play it here. It's an F. Next, it's Mystic Forge. 4 generic mana for a mythic rare artifact. You may look at the top card of your library anytime. You may cast artifact spells and colorless spells from the top of your library. Tap, pay 1 life, exile the top card of your library. This has the ability to draw you a significant number of cards because this set is so artifact-centric. Your deck isn't going to be so filled with artifacts that this will be completely insane, of course, but I see this drawing you a few cards most of the time when you play it, especially because you can exile away lands and non-artifacts. It's probably a B-, in a deck where you end up with like 10 plus artifacts, it gets better than that, but that's not going to happen with regularity. Next, it's Ornithopter, which for 0 generic mana is a 0/2 artifact creature Thopter at uncommon. It has flying. This is another 0 mana artifact that doesn't really give you a full card of value. You just don't get enough out of a 0/2 flyer to make it worth a card, and that matters a lot. This can basically come down and chump block something, and sometimes you can equip it or give it some counters, which makes it a little more interesting, but that's a lot of work to make a terrible card passable. I'm giving this a D. Next, it's Perilous Vault, which for 4 generic mana is a mythic rare artifact. You can pay 5 and tap it and exile all non-land permanents. This is a lot of mana, but it's also quite the reset button as it rids the board of all permanents apart from lands, even exiling them. The effect is almost unrivaled in its ability to change the state of the game, and Power Stones make it more doable, though you are going to lose them when you activate this. All that good stuff out of the way, it does still have the real problem of being bad in situations where you're ahead or at parity, but it is just about the best thing you can get when you're behind. I'm giving it a B. Next, it's Phyrexian Processor, which for 4 generic mana is a mythic rare artifact. When it enters the battlefield, you pay any amount of life, and you pay 4 and tap it to make an XX Black Phyrexian Minion creature token, where X is the life paid as it entered the battlefield. This can churn out some beefy tokens, and that's something made easier by Power Stones. It does cost a fair bit of mana and life to get it going, but it is a pretty insane engine once it's in play. I'm giving it a B+. Next up, it's Phyrexian Revoker, which for 2 generic mana is a 2/1 artifact creature Phyrexian Horror at rare. When it enters the battlefield, you choose a non-land card name. Activated abilities of sources with the chosen name can be activated. You won't always get to do something with that enter the battlefield ability, but when you do get to shut down activated abilities, it'll feel nice, and the fail case is a 2 mana 2/1 with a useful card type. This format has a higher number of activated abilities on lower rarity cards than most do because they wanted to support the Power Stones, so you'll probably have something to name a little more often than you might think. It's a C. Next, it's Platinum Angel, which for 7 generic is a 4/4 artifact creature angel at mythic rare. It's got flying, and you can't lose the game, and your opponents can't win the game. Making it so you can't lose and your opponent can't win is obviously pretty oppressive, and the angel can even help you win the game with its 4/4 flying body. The downside of the card is always the massive mana investment coupled with the fact that it dies to a whole lot of stuff. And while the latter is still going to be true, the mana will be easier to come by in this format than normal. Once again, Power Stones. If she sticks around, your opponent just can't win, obviously, and that's enough for her to get into the lower bomb range. She does still die a lot and gives you absolutely zero value in situations where your opponent untaps and kills her, and that keeps her from being completely absurd, but she's still great, giving her that A-. Next up, it's Precursor Golem, which for 5 generic mana is a 3/3 artifact creature golem at rare. When it enters the battlefield, you create 2 3/3 colorless golem artifact creature tokens. Whenever a player casts an instant or sorcery spell that targets only a single golem, that player copies that spell for each other golem that spell could target. Each copy targets a different one of those golems. 5 mana for 3/3s is pretty insane, though the golem does give up one of the big advantages of producing multiple bodies. Usually, the fact that you can make multiple bodies makes your opponent's spot removal bad, but it's not really true here. If your opponent casts removal on one of your golems, it hits all of them. The upside is that your combat tricks that target one golem also target all of them, and while that isn't quite as big of a deal as the downside is, it's nice that the effect isn't all downside. Also, be careful if you have some other golems, as this set does have them, and they will get blown up by a single removal spell. Flip side is if your opponent has golems, theirs will also eat that removal spell. All that said, if your opponent doesn't have removal, these 3 golem bodies are really going to overwhelm them on turn 5, giving this a B+. Next up, it's Pristine Talisman, which for 3 generic mana is an uncommon artifact. You can tap it for colorless, and you gain 1 life. 3 mana for a mana rock that only produces colorless is far from ideal, but the fact this format has a ramp theme makes a difference. Incidental life gain doesn't hurt either, giving it a C-. Next, it's Psychosis Crawler, which for 5 generic mana is a rare artifact creature Phyrexian Horror. Its power and toughness are each equal to the number of cards in your hand. Whenever you draw a card, each opponent loses 1 life. In most games of Limited, it is hard to keep this at like an efficient size. It's going to be like a 2-2 or 3-3, but it's nice that your card draw effects really hurt your opponent, and this format has a card draw deck in blue-black that's already going to be wanting to draw a card. So this is pretty nice, though not something you want to take that highly. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Quicksilver Amulet, which for 4 generic mana is a rare artifact. You can pay 4 and tap it to put a creature card from your hand onto the battlefield. This is the kind of effect that's easy to overrate because you think of the ideal situation of slamming some monster into play, but that's hard to consistently line up in Limited, even in this format, and this asks for so much mana to do that job, 8 over 2 turns, that it almost isn't worth it anyway. This kind of thing never gives you an actual card of value because it basically just gives you a discount. It does let you play creatures at instant speed, which is something, but we've seen this card and cards like it before, and they're always really bad and Limited. You just don't have the right power level of things and a critical mass of things with high power levels to play this. It's an F. Next, it's Quietus Spike, which for 3 generic is a rare artifact equipment. The equipped creature has Death Touch. When the equipped creature deals combat damage to a player, that player loses half their life rounded up, and it equips for 3. This isn't very good. 3 to play and 3 to equip for Death Touch is a lot, even with Power Stones, and yeah, if you hit your opponent, they lose life or whatever. But the creature wielding this really can't kill the opponent on its own, since it's always half, and you're far from guaranteed to actually get your creature in for damage. Sure, your opponent has to block whatever is attacking to not take the damage, but that's often not a bad deal because of the amount of work it takes just to equip this. I think it's a D. Next up, it's Ramos Dragon Engine, which for 6 generic mana is a 4/4 legendary artifact creature dragon at Mythic Rare. It's got flying. Whenever you cast a spell, you put a +1/+1 counter on it for each of that spell's colors, and you can remove 5 +1/+1 counters from it to add 2 of each color of mana. Activate only once each turn. Here's the combo with Door to Nothingness. Unlike Door to Nothingness, though, this is actually a good card. A 6 mana 4/4 flyer is already kind of playable, probably like a C-, and this has the massive upside of gaining counters when you cast colored spells. This format does not have a big multicolored theme, so most of the time you'll be gaining 1 counter at a time, but that's plenty on a flyer. You won't really find yourself ever using that ability to remove counters, of course, but that doesn't matter either. The rest of the card's pretty strong, giving it a B+. Next up, it's Rune Chanter's Pike, which for 2 generic mana is a rare artifact equipment. Equipped creature has first strike and gets +X/+0, where X is the number of instant and sorcery cards in your graveyard, and it equips for 2. In the right deck, this makes basically any creature into a real threat that just can't be blocked effectively, and luckily this format does have a deck interested in instants and sorceries, and there's also a pretty hefty self-mill theme. It's definitely a build-around because this is bad if you aren't granting a significant power boost to go with first strike. If you have fewer than about 5 instants and sorceries, it's a D or worse, but in a deck with like 8 or more, it becomes a B. Next up, it's Scrap Trawler, which for 3 generic mana is a rare artifact creature construct. It's a 3/2, and when it or another artifact you control is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, return to your hand target artifact card in your graveyard with lesser mana value. If you can have this trade and get an artifact back, you're going to feel pretty good about it, and that's not an insanely tall order. It obviously gets better if you can trade other artifacts and get back value, and if you can combine it with sacrifice effects, which this format has, it gets even sillier. Basically, this is a 3 mana 3/2 with a fairly attainable, though not always available, 2-for-1 upside, giving it a C+. Next, it's Sculpting Steel, which for 3 generic mana is a rare artifact. It enters the battlefield as a copy of any artifact on the battlefield. This format has a lot of artifacts you can copy, including the ones your opponent plays. It won't always be easy to get 3 mana of value in the early game, but in the mid to late game, it will be pretty hard not to get something pretty sweet. I'm giving this a B. Next up, it's Self-Assembler, which for 5 generic mana is an uncommon artifact creature assembly worker. It's a 4/4. When it enters the battlefield, you may search your library for an assembly worker, reveal it, put it into your hand, and then shuffle. Last time we saw this, it was the only assembly worker in the set, so you needed multiple copies of it to get it going, and that was actually fairly doable, and it was a nice card. A 5 mana 4/4 that draws you another 5 mana 4/4 is a good thing in Limited. Efficiency matters, but outcarding your opponent matters a lot too. In this set, there are plenty of other assembly workers for you to search up, so it is probably even better. It does need a build-around grade, as you don't play this if you have 0 assembly workers to search up, and even just having one other assembly worker is a little sketchy, as once you draw them both, you're kind of in trouble, and this just becomes a 5 mana 4/4. So you really need 2 or more assembly workers to get this going, but the good news is, that's very doable. So an F in a deck without other assembly workers, and a B- in a deck with 2 or more. Next, it's Semblance Anvil, which for 3 generic is a rare artifact with imprint. When it enters the battlefield, you can exile a non-land card from your hand. Spells you cast that share a card type with the exiled card cost 2 less to cast. Yeah, 2 for winning yourself to get a discount on one type of spell is not what you want to be doing in Limited 99% of the time. You end up putting yourself way back only for a discount, which is basically going to lose you the game. It's an F. Next up, it's Sigil of Valor, which for 2 generic is an uncommon artifact equipment. Whenever a equipped creature attacks alone, it gets +1/+1 until end of turn. For each other creature you control, equip 1. This seems like it'll be fine. It is definitely rough that sometimes it offers no bonus at all, but there are enough boards in the mid to late game where equipping this does some work. Only attacking with one thing is definitely a big restriction, but this can also make lots of creatures into threats on mini board states. The setup and restriction are pretty real, and it did underperform last time we saw it. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, it's Soul Guide Lantern, which for 1 generic mana is an uncommon artifact. When it enters the battlefield, exile target card from a graveyard. You can tap it and sack it to exile each opponent's graveyard, and you can pay 1 and tap it to sack it to draw a card. So, another artifact that replaces itself, making it useful already. It also hates on the graveyard, something else of value in a format with Unearth and a couple of graveyard decks around. You can main deck this pretty happily, giving it a C. Next up, it's Spring Leaf Drum, which for 1 generic mana is an uncommon artifact. You can tap it and an untapped creature you control to add 1 mana of any color. It's surprisingly hard to set up this kind of mana ramp consistently in Limited. This can get your mana going incredibly fast, provided you have some early creatures to go with it, but that's far from guaranteed, and then by the mid to late game, it's basically useless, giving it a D. Next up, it's Staff of Domination, which for 3 generic mana is a mythic rare artifact. You can pay 1 to untap it. You can also pay 2 and tap it to gain 1. You can pay 3 and tap it to untap target creature. You can pay 4 and tap it to tap target creature, or you can pay 5 and tap it to draw a card. This isn't anywhere close to efficient at any of these things, but it does make up for that a little bit because it can untap itself and keep using these abilities. That is a lot of mana, but this could be a real win condition for Power Stone ramp decks. Still, the first few turns after you play it feel really bad, since you aren't really doing anything with it for a while, and then once you do, it takes some pretty amazing effort. It's probably just a C-. Next up, it's Sundering Titan, which is one of my favorite cards, but unfortunately not great in Limited. 8 generic mana for a 7/10 artifact creature golem at Mythic Rare. When it enters or leaves the battlefield, choose a land of each basic land type and then destroy them. This is a big monster that you can ramp into in the format, and in the majority of games, you can use the land destruction effect to hurt your opponent more than it hurts you, though if you and your opponent are in completely different colors, it'll hurt you both equally. The effect is often negligible when you play it though, and yeah, 7/10 is big, but it also doesn't come with evasion or anything else. There are definitely some commons and uncommons in the set that have prototype that are just better if you're in the market for ramping into things. This is probably just a D+. Next up, it's Swiftfoot Boots, which for 2 generic mana is an artifact equipment at uncommon. Equipped creature has hexproof and haste, and it equips for only 1 mana. These are pretty nice on the right creature, though the downside is, of course, that the creature you put it on already has to be good or it's not really worth putting them on. That said, once you have a creature worth protecting, the boots are a nightmare for your opponent. It doesn't hurt that they can also give haste for sort of paying a kicker of 1, something that really can change your attacks. I think these are a B-. Next up, it's Sword of the Meek, which for 2 generic mana is a rare artifact equipment. Equipped creature gets +1/+2, and it equips for 2. Whenever a 1/1 creature enters the battlefield under your control, you may return Sword of the Meek from your graveyard to the battlefield and attach it to that creature. 2 to play and 2 to equip for this bonus is a D+. But this format actually has some stuff going on that makes this kind of interesting. While you can't go full-on Thopter Sword combo, the format does have a lot of 1/1 creature tokens, so sacrificing this to something in the black-red deck and then making a creature token one way or another means you get it back, and at that point you've gotten some nice value even if you don't do anything else, and you can even just sacrifice it again if you have the means. Still, probably just a C. Next up, it's Thorn of Amethyst, which for 2 generic mana is a rare artifact. Non-creature spells cost 1 more to cast. This is kind of interesting. If you are a super heavy creature deck, the tax this puts on your opponent can be kind of interesting, but ending up in such a deck is hard to do in Limited, and this is still something that doesn't add to the board in a meaningful way, and there's going to be lots of games where it doesn't do anything, giving it a D. Next up, it's Unwinding Clock, which for 4 generic mana is a rare artifact. Untap all artifacts you control during each other player's untap step. This has some potential applications. With Power Stones and a plethora of mana sink activated abilities, you may actually be able to generate some value with this. It also gives your artifact creatures pseudo-vigilance, but those are all sort of ideal situations with the card, and there'll be plenty of times where it's meaningless. I think it's another D. Next up, it's Well of Lost Dreams, which for 4 generic mana is a rare artifact. Whenever you gain life, you can pay X, where X is less than or equal to the amount of life you gained. If you do, draw X cards. There are ways to gain life in this format, and I think there are actually enough of them that this isn't a straight up F, though it will be in most decks. But if you have 5 or more ways to gain life, especially if some of them are repeatable, this can draw you some cards, and Power Stones will make it easier for you to pay the cost. It is a bit of a bummer that this is the only life gain payoff in the whole set, making it less organic for you to find somewhere to play this. It probably has a ceiling around a C+ as a result of the limited amount of life gain in the set. And we're finishing things off with Wormcoil Engine, which is 6 mana for a 6/6 artifact creature, Phyrexian Golem at Mythic Rare. It's got Death Touch and Lifelink, and when it dies, you create a 3/3 colorless Phyrexian Worm artifact creature token with Death Touch, and a 3/3 colorless Phyrexian Worm artifact creature token with Lifelink. So this is one of the best of all of these. A 6 mana 6/6 with Death Touch and Lifelink is a B, and this comes with the absurd effect of leaving behind 2 3/3 tokens, each with one of those keywords. So your opponent either gets killed by this massive 6/6 that puts the game out of reach thanks to Lifelink, or they get like 3 for 1 or worse. Yeah, that's a bomb. It's definitely an A. Keep in mind, exile effects and aura-based removal do make the engine a little sad, but still a bomb. So now we've looked at every single card that can appear in a draft booster in this format. Still not quite done though, as tomorrow I'll be bringing you my archetype guide where I talk about the various synergies within each color pair. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you want to catch up on the rest of the set review, you should see the playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.